Now, let's move on to perspective today. My guest links together a series of diverse subjects that you'd be pretty clever if you could work out exactly what the link is. Now, the subjects are art, the mentally ill, and Hitler. His book, The Gallery of Miracles and Madness, Insanity, Modernism, and Hitler's War on Art, tells of how modern art was inspired originally by the work of psychiatric patients, and how Hitler, rejected from art school, turned on modern artists, destroying their creations, and then even turning on the psychiatric patients who'd inspired them. Many of the patients gassed in a forerunner even for the Holocaust. Well, author and former journalist for The Guardian newspaper, Charlie English, joins us now to talk a lot more about that. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme. I mean, I summarised it incredibly briefly there, but let's go through and explain it a little bit more. Firstly, how psychiatric patients were encouraged to create art.
Well, there were hundreds, obviously hundreds of thousands of them in asylums and psychiatric institutions all over the world. And I don't think they were necessarily encouraged to create it in the sense that they might be today. But they were very bored. Their lives were almost meaningless. They were kind of isolated from society completely. And a lot of them just began to make things. I mean, they didn't always think that it was art that they were making, but they wanted an outlet for their creativity, if you like, and they wanted to express themselves. And so there was very little else to do. So thousands and thousands of objects of art were produced in asylums all over the world, and that's really what was collected in Heidelberg.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible, isn't it, what that creativity then actually led to?
Yeah, I mean, this assistant psychiatrist in Heidelberg put together this amazing collection of thousands of pieces of material. I mean, I think something like 5,000 plus in a couple of years, and then produced a book based on this material, which really inspired the avant-garde modern artists who were working at that time. They were already interested in the idea of madness because it offered a way into the human psyche, and they were trying to explore this vast interior world that Freud had more or less discovered or kind of charted, and they wanted to explore that within themselves. And they thought that madness offered a key, a kind of way to get to the raw human being inside.
At the same time, though, Adolf Hitler himself, he was having rather a bad time with art, wasn't he?
Yes, I mean, he had, I think you could say, quite a few talents in his early life, but one of them he believed was his ability to draw, and he spent a lot of his childhood drawing and believed he would be a great artist. And of course, famously traveled to Vienna to try to get into the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, but was rejected twice in 1907 and 1908. And I mean, managed to scrape a living knocking out copies of tourist postcards in Vienna and later Munich. But he was never the successful professional artist that he wanted to be.
And then he kind of turned on art, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he was a very conservative. I mean, that sounds ridiculous to say, but he was obviously an extreme conservative, and he detested the idea of modernism in art per se, and he particularly hated the idea that art could be influenced by insanity, or that artists could draw their inspiration from insanity. Because I mean, his idea of art was very much the kind of chocolate boxy late 19th century romantic art that's very highly worked, very skillfully produced, but really in the 1920s said almost nothing to the industrializing Western world. So he really began a war against modernism and modern art that started very early in his political career. I mean, in the early 1920s.
And how far did that go? I mean, in the book you describe and tell the stories of what actually happened to some of the artists and some of those psychiatric patients as well.
He took it to the limit. I mean, he in the mid 1930s, the Nazis staged their famous degenerate art shows, which were, I mean, millions of people were bussed in, and special trains were laid on so that people could see these exhibitions. And they're still the most visited of all time, but they weren't really art shows in the way that we see them as a way of promoting and projecting art. They were a way of shaming modern art. And these exhibitions toured the country. Some of the psychiatric art was placed alongside professional art in these shows so that the inference was that the mad people were even better at art than the modernists were. And then Hitler and the Nazis burnt a lot of the modernist collections in Germany, destroyed it in other ways, or sold it off. So he really took what was one of the greatest art collections in the world, national art collections, and destroyed it. And in its place, he produced or promoted this dreadful Nazi art, which glorified the Aryan race. And German culture as he saw it.
And of course, we all know what the Nazi regime was responsible for in the end as well. I mean, do you see what happened, as a bit of a forerunner into what happened?
Yeah, I mean, the professional art was destroyed. The outsider artists, the psychiatric artists, were literally killed. I mean, the forerunner to the Holocaust really was this psychiatric Holocaust, in which the Nazis used prototype gas chambers to murder initially 70,000 psychiatric patients in Germany, and then it was expanded into a kind of wider program across the country, where another 130,000 were starved or overdosed to death. And this was the prototype for the wider Holocaust, which began later in the war. So they really took this ideology of genetic purity as expressed in art and took it to the ultimate extreme, which was to destroy people who they didn't believe were pure enough.
And Charlie, we're running out of time, but let me just ask you very, very quickly. I mean, what inspired you to take this on and write about this in your book?
Well, I just thought the story was incredible. I mean, I thought it covered, as you said, so many fascinating areas of 20th century history. I like to write about cultural issues, and it seemed incredible to me that art could have affected politics in this extraordinary way.
Well summed up. Thanks very much for talking to us today, Charlie English. That book then called The Gallery of Miracles and Madness, Insanity, Modernism and Hitler's War on Art. Thanks very much for joining us. The main headlines then on the programme. The EU Commission head Ursula von der Leyen set to hail Europe's successful vaccination programme as she gives her State of the Union speech starting in around 15 minutes' time or so. She's also set to discuss proposals for a European defence force. And around 2/3 of Californians have voted to keep their governor, Gavin Newsom. Republicans apparently failing in their bid to oust him in a recall election.